Thank you very much, Anupama. This raises questions about what would it mean to annihilate caste, and in terms of markers. And I would like to point out, she wasn't able to present. It's a very dense and part of her PhD thesis. So you can imagine density is supposed to be. Theses are supposed to be very dense. So she has a lot more to say. But what I would like to point out here is what she is offering to us as three modes in which questions regarding dress can be raised in this context, in the caste context. And as she suggests that we look at the tropes or the frames suggested by mimicry, respectability, and defiance. I'll leave this for you to think about while we now move on to our last speaker, Mohammed Sajjad.
Initially, I was interested in speaking on something else, but my guilt is I did not send my abstract. When I asked for the schedule, I found myself categorized to be speaking on annihilation of caste. I'm not much comfortable in this topic, but there were certain questions which have been emerging in my mind, and I tried to reason out with some people, but I could not get answer, and I'm yet to get answer. So I'm sharing my questions as to why did the leaders who are now being identified as the icons of the Pasmanda movement, why did not such leaders engage themselves with Ambedkar and Lohia? Similarly, my question is also to why did not Ambedkar engage with such kinds of leaders, their Muslim counterparts, or did Lohia engage himself with such leaders? So I tried to look into the current developments in Pasmanda movement and then evaluating it by reading two texts of Ambedkar, Annihilation of Castes and Pakistan or Partition of India. This text of Ambedkar, Pakistan or Partition of India, was in the discussion during the last 2 years for another reason, whether it is Islamophobic or not. I am engaging with this text with the perspective of whether they engaged with the question of caste among Muslims or not, or if they engaged, to what extent. So I start with Abdul Qayyum Ansari, who is the icon of this movement. On December 8, 1939, he wrote a letter to Jawaharlal Nehru. This letter has now become famous as 6-point demand put forward by Abdul Qayyum Ansari. Interestingly, all these 6 demands have one word, Momin, which is used for only one community of the many communities which are who are now categorized as one category, Pasmanda. So he is talking only of one community, the community to which he belonged. May I read out the 6 demands? He is asking for at least one minister to be taken from the Momin community. This is first demand. The second demand, 50% of the seats in central or federal legislatures and each of the provincial legislatures be reserved for the Muslims, and some be allotted to the members of the Momin community. Third demand is like that. Fourth, in all these 6 demands he is asking for, he is mentioning only one community, that is Momins. So what we see that in these 6 demands, one can take note of the fact that demands being made were exclusively for one community, and it was not for the other communities falling into the category of Ajlaf and Arzal. Both these communities have now been clubbed together to be identified as Pasmanda, which is understandable. Unless these oppressed categories unite together, they can't have a way forward. So this is understandable. But at the same time, we also have to take a note of caution about that as well. So Abdul Qayyum Ansari was a Congress nominee from Bihar to the Constituent Assembly. He also served on its advisory committee on fundamental rights and minorities and tribals. I have not been able to verify if Ansari was really into the Constituent Assembly. However, regardless of this fact, what I am curious to know if Ansari really made any intervention for inclusion of the Arzal communities of Muslims into the category of scheduled castes. I am also curious to know that when in 1950 with a presidential ordinance such communities from Buddhists were being included into the scheduled caste category, did Ansari really speak out for the Arzal communities? Ansari was also a member of Backward Class Commission appointed by Government of India in 1953-55. Now coming to Dr. Ambedkar, chapter 10 with the title Social Stagnation of his book Pakistan or Partition of India raises the question of social evils among Hindus, found also among Muslims, child marriage, legal rights to women. He asserts that regardless of the scriptural provisions, the Muslim, I quote, the Muslim woman is the most helpless person in the world. He then goes on to the caste system among India's Muslims, referring to the census report 1901. Bengal, he identifies the three categories of communities among Muslims. That is the only page which talks about caste, to the best of my understanding, namely Ashraf, Ajlaf and Arzal. Interestingly, Ambedkar puts the cultivating sheikhs in the category of Ajlaf. Otherwise, sheikhs are categorized as Ashraf. Yet, Dr. Ambedkar overall refuses to engage even with the Arzal category of Muslims. He has identified some communities referring to the census: Bhangar, Halal Khor, Hijra, Kasbi, Lal Begi, Mogta, Mehtar. These kinds of communities he puts in the Arzal category. So to the best of my limited knowledge, Ambedkar did not talk of including these categories into the category of scheduled castes. The Ambedkar himself was, as one can understand from this text, that he himself was not ready to accept those Dalits as Dalits who left Hinduism and converted to Islam or Christianity. This is my question. Then, in the entire text, this book is it consists of more than 500 pages. The entire text talks of Muslims as a monolith, except that page where he is categorizing Ashraf, Ajlaf, and Arzal. And then he says, there is thus a stagnation not only in the, I quote him, there is thus a stagnation not only in the social life but also in the political life of the Muslim community. And please note, he is not saying Muslim communities of India. The Muslims have no interest in politics as such. Their predominant interest is religion. This can be easily seen by the terms and conditions that a Muslim constituency makes for its support to a candidate fighting for a seat. The Muslim constituency does not care to examine the program of the candidate. All that the constituency wants from the candidate is that he should agree to replace the old lamps of the masjid by supplying new ones at his cost, to provide a new carpet for the masjid because the old one is torn. In some places, a Muslim constituency is quite satisfied if the candidate agrees to give a sumptuous feast. With Muslims, election is a mere matter of money and is very seldom a matter of social program, of general improvement. Muslim politics takes no note of purely secular categories of life, namely the differences between rich and poor, capital and labor, lord and tenant, priest and layman, reason and superstition, and so on. Now coming to Ambedkar's annihilation of caste. In its section 11, he treats Muslims again as a monolith. His text reads as if Muslims and Sikhs have no caste. He asks, I quote, why Hindus are coward and from where does the Sikh or the Mohammedan derives his strength which makes him brave and fearless, unquote. He then answers, I am sure it is not due to the strength arising out of the feeling that all Sikhs will come to the rescue of a Sikh when he is in danger and that all Mohammedans will rush to save a Muslim if he is attacked. The Hindu can derive no such strength. He cannot feel assured that his fellows will come to his help. Being one and fated to be alone, he remains powerless, develops timidity and cowardice, and in a fight surrenders or runs away. the Sikh as well as the Muslim stand fearless and gives battle because he knows that though one, he will not be alone. A Hindu will quite meekly tolerate an insult as well as a wrong. Unquote. My query is, if this text does not confirm certain stereotypes about Muslims, I think these kinds of stereotypes are often found among the Hindutva propagandists. We find similar stereotyping in chapter 11, which is titled Communal Aggression of his text Pakistan or Partition of India. Ambedkar writes, I have used 1945 edition. Quote, the Hindu's spirit of aggression is a new phase which he has just begun to cultivate. The Muslim's spirit of aggression is his native endowment and is very much ancient as compared with that of the Hindu. He says it after providing empirical details of communal violence during 1920-40. So the text suggests as if only Muslims are aggressor in these all communal clashes of 2 decades. These details largely put Hindus as hapless victims. I quote, massacres, forcible conversions, desecration of temples, foul outrages upon women, such as ripping open pregnant women, pillage, arson and destruction, in short, all the accompaniments of brutal and unrestrained barbarism were perpetrated freely by the Mughals upon the Hindus until such time as troops could be hurried to the task of restoring order through a difficult and extensive tracts of the country. This was not a Hindu-Muslim riot, this was just a Bartholomew. Please mark Ambedkar's 2 words, native endowment and ancient. My query is if he refers all Muslims to be of foreign origin, whereas he also refers to Ajlaf or lower class Mohammedans as cultivating sheikhs and others who were originally Hindus but who do not, I quote him, who do not belong to any functional group and have not gained admittance to the Ashraf community, that is Pirali and Thakrai. Dr. Ambedkar then prognosticates, it is not that the, I quote him, it is not that the Hindu, if given time, will not pick up and overtake the Muslim. But as matters stand today, the Muslim in this exhibition of the spirit of aggression leaves the Hindu far behind. His stereotyping continues. Without social union, political unity is difficult to be achieved. If achieved, it would be as precarious as a summer sapling, liable to be uprooted by the gust of a hostile wind. With mere political unity, India may be a state, but to be a state is not to be a nation. It doesn't stop there. Referring to the Azad Muslim Conference of the anti-League Muslims, when they had gathered in Delhi in April 1940, in March 1940, Muslim League had passed the resolution which later became famous as Pakistan resolution. Against this resolution, thousands of Muslims had gathered in Delhi and that was called Azad Muslim Conference. Ambedkar warns about this conference as well. I quote him, there is therefore no ground to trust that they, that is Muslims, will be more merciful to the Hindus than the Muslim League has been or will be. He asserts, there is a difference between safeguard to allay apprehension of the weak and contrivances to satisfy the ambition for power of the strong, that there is a difference between providing safeguards and handing over the country. He is suspicious of, very openly suspicious of the nationalist Muslims as well. He concludes the chapter with these words, and we should also remember that in the narratives of Pasmanda, it is referred that as many as 40,000 of Muslims who had gathered in the Azad Muslim Conference, these 40,000 were mobilized by the leaders like Abdul Qayyum Ansari and Asim Bihari. So he concludes that chapter, Ambedkar concludes that chapter with these words. These are important considerations. If the Hindus overlook them, they will do so at their peril. For the Muslim alternative to partition is really a frightful and dangerous alternative. He is talking about the Muslim alternative, that is those Muslims who are opposed to the League. So, Dr. Ambedkar is expressing his deep mistrust even against those Muslims who are opposed to the League politics of communal territorial separatism. He looks at the Muslim resistance to India's partition and to the proposals of the Azad Muslim Conference as a deceptive power play, a strategy to gain power by manufacturing grievances, either, as he uses a term which I learned only through his book, gravamen politics, or as a power politics. Let us also recall that in concluding this section now I switch over to his text, Annihilation of Caste, where in the section 26 he prescribes, in my opinion, only when the Hindu society becomes a casteless society that it can hope to have strength enough to defend itself. Without such internal strength, Swaraj for Hindus may turn out to be only a step towards slavery. Goodbye and good wishes for your success. Interestingly, we find no such good wishes of a casteless society in the case of India's Muslims. Or do we? Because I am not well read in all the texts of Ambedkar. Since the current phase of the Pasmanda movement derives so much from Dr. Ambedkar, may we know if they are aware of these positions of Baba Sahib. My other note of caution for the current proponents of the Pasmanda movement is about something Lohia had cautioned way back in June 1963. I read out. Some among the low castes such as Ahirs, Julahas and Chamars are numerically large. Other low castes such as Mali, Teli, Kahar, etc. are small when taken separately, but taken together their number is much greater. As a result, when low castes rise and caste system is attacked, the major beneficiaries are the numerically big castes. To some extent, this is inevitable, but one has to be alert so that the other low castes also may be invigorated and leaders drawn from their ranks. So from the above discussion, we also need to know if the current Dalit intellectual activists and legislators are really sincere about pressing for inclusion of the Arzal communities of Muslims into the list of the scheduled castes. Because we see demand from the sections of Muslims, or perhaps all Muslims, that let the Dalit counterpart of Muslims be included into the scheduled caste. I am not aware if current Dalit legislators are really as much sincere about welcoming them into the fold of scheduled castes. So, with these questions, I will conclude by sharing my question. I am intrigued, why did not Ambedkar, while endorsing separate electorate as an arrangement to checkmate social, not religious discrimination? In another text, Ambedkar, his book, State and Minorities, What Are Their Rights and How to Secure Them in the Constitution of Free India. There he says that separate, he seems to be justifying separate electorate because on the ground that it is because of the social discrimination which has to be taken care of through these arrangements. So this should not be taken as religious. The identity of religion should not be emphasized. So he says that this will checkmate the social discrimination. But my concern is that while arguing for while justifying this separate electorate, why did not he advocate the idea that okay, Muslims have got separate electorate, you keep it differentially, but you split it into the categories of Ashraf, Ajlaf and Arzal, and that arrangement should be there. So he is not talking about it. Even after party independence also, we don't see it there. Even, as I said, even in the current scenario, we don't see like that, where the Dalit legislators will be asking, "Kya bhai, aa jaiye, hum aapke liye khade hain." There
थैंक यू वेरी मच सजाद। तो अब जैसा कि आप देख ही रहे हैं कि मामला और जाति हाँ वही जाति का उन्मूलन केवल जाति का उन्मूलन नहीं हो सकता। एनिहिलेशन ऑफ कास्ट कैन नॉट बी अ सिंगल आइटम एजेंडा and it will have to be raised along with other issues as well. We must also remember that, as has been suggested, the question is about the annihilation of caste. While this question was perhaps most brilliantly and most precociously suggested by Baba Sahib Ambedkar, we are not here really to debate Baba Sahib Ambedkar as such. We are here to debate about the annihilation of caste, in which a persistent problem has been attitude towards those, whatever a set of politicians or a set of people who have a position on the annihilation of caste or on caste issues, what is their position on caste outside of Hinduism has always been an important issue, and that is an issue that remains important even today. I think it would be better if we, since all three presentations have come at things from very different angles, to remember that we are यहाँ सवालों का है, तो इसलिए उम्मीद है कि आप सब भी सवाल पूछना चाहेंगे. So we will try and take questions in batches of 3 or 4, and then give an opportunity to the panelists to respond. And so please raise your hands if you would like to ask a question so that I can recognize you. There is 1, 2, in the interests of equity, somebody from this side? No. Okay, so first 3 questions, yes. Please try and ask questions rather than make long statements. Thank you.
So my question is for Sajjad sir. So I'm not sure if we are doing justice to a text written so many years ago to claims about Muslims made by Hindutvawadis. Of course, we can hermeneutically read a text, and when we hear, when you just read out what is written about Muslims, I'm reminded of Gyanendra Pandey's essay on the bigoted Julaha. And when he writes that at that time it was very prevalent, this notion about Julahas being very aggressive about their religion. And I think the British had coined the term that Julahas are interested in nothing but their mills and their religion. And it was they who had constructed this identity of the bigoted Julaha. The bigoted means a religious bigot. Of course, I'm not trying to defend, I'm not trying to insinuate that Ambedkar got the concept of the aggressive Muslim from British constructs of the Muslim, but I don't know, maybe we could consider this, that at that time there were these stereotypes about Muslims which were quite prevalent, which had been woven by the British themselves.
रिस्पॉन्ड करूँ या अभी आने में?
3 सवाल पूछ लें, उसके बाद फिर तीनों के एक साथ.
Thank you for your all fascinating presentations, and I could say this is a development that how we understand annihilation of caste at this point of time, and I had a long debate and discussion with Dr. Harris in JNU. I would like to reiterate the same question here.
In brief.
Yes. When you are proposing annihilation of caste is not an essential text. I think I'm also a PhD student working on Ambedkar. I would say this is not misreading, but I would say it is misreading. Because yourself you contradict when you are proposing the idea of democracy, liberty, equality, fraternity. It is very much there in the text. And this text, if you say it is not for Dalits, I would say in other way, in my reading, it is for Dalit, for everybody, the caste Hindu and Dalit. Because it is Dalit who are sufferers of caste and they have to take the battle. That's what Ambedkar hinting to Gandhi. It is whether you take, in the text itself, whether you take this battle for your to annihilate caste or not. But I take it seriously. I am for this. So this is what that I would like to engage with you, and yes, same thing I would again say annihilation of caste actually resonates democracy, and that is the thing that we are missing. And I would last presentation. It is also very interesting to read Ambedkar thought in Pakistan and this essay, But Ambedkar, if you reduce Ambedkar and saying that Ambedkar was not ever about Pasmanda Muslim and trying to understand Muslim question from the upper class Muslim, that is also a kind of misunderstanding Ambedkar, because Ambedkar vehemently criticized Hindu, and in the same very text also criticized the limitation, the Parda system, the evil practice, social practices of Islam. So I think we have to consider, yes, Ambedkar must have some limitation to understand the caste question within the Muslim, and Ambedkar time and again expect that somebody should take the question of their own community. That's what Ambedkar was hinting all the time, and that case goes to Pasmanda Muslim as well.
Thank you. Thank you. At the back.
मैं तो सिर्फ इतना जानना चाह रहा था कि अम्बेडकर साहब की जो वाइफ रही अदर कास्ट रिलीजन की रही उन पर इल्जाम लगा कि ओवर इंसुलिन का डोज दे दिया था. दिस इज ट्रू और नॉट?
ये सवाल इनको यहाँ नहीं सुलझाया जा सकता.
जासूसी सवाल है.
तो किसी और का कोई सवाल हो? अनुपमा के लिए कोई सवाल? यस.
यहाँ जोर से बोलिए, उनको माइक दे दीजिए.
Yeah, so like I'm very new to the entire idea of caste, so I'm sorry if there's any naivety. But my question is that when the idea of something like clothing is concerned, isn't there a sort of aspirational value that is attached to it? And that value comes from the kind of oppression that people are facing. So their idea of breaking out of that oppression becomes that this clothing is associated with our oppressors, so we can break out of our oppression by associating with this clothing. But doesn't that kind of like go back into the oppressive structure by like it does not break it? It kind of seems to be that when you have an aspirational value of the oppressor, then you, I'm not able to frame it, but you go back to that structure and you kind of, you further fuel it, is what I am asking. Does that aspirational value somehow get fixed?
थैंक यू. थैंक यू. सो अब आप लोगों की बारी है, तो उल्टी दिशा में पढ़ेंगे. तो पहले सजाद साहब आप.
Eva, to your question, I am referring to two things simultaneously. His stereotyping, Ambedkar's stereotyping of Muslims, which I did not emphasize as much. My question is, my concern was that he did not address Muslim caste adequately. He treated Muslims as monolith in both the texts. And another question which is quite related with it, that even those leaders who are now being made out as icon of the Pasmanda movement, that term was not in use at that point of time, even they did not engage with. Ambedkar was alive till 1956, Lohia was alive till 1967, and Abdul Qayyum Ansari was alive till 1974. So even after independence, there is no engagement with the of the Pasmanda leaders with them, and of those leaders with the Pasmanda leaders. That is intriguing. So when a Pasmanda narrative comes that Maulana Azad was silent in Constituent Assembly debate, my point is even Abdul Qayyum Ansari was also silent. Whether he was inside the Constituent Assembly or outside doesn't matter. He also did not press for the Arzal communities of Muslims to be included into the scheduled caste. He was only talking of moments and moments. This is what the historical records say.
Jasmani, I really wanted to misread this text. That was the attempt. Why? Because the conventional reading is, of course, what you said. That is the conventional reading. It's the available reading to all of us. And that conventional reading is often utilized to criticize the existing Dalit movement often. Suggesting that somewhere annihilation of caste is the ideal. Ambedkar hoped for that. And with that particular aggression, it was suggested that if you are raising a caste issue, a caste politics, or even the concern for reservation, it is nothing but going against the ideals of Ambedkar. That is annihilation of caste. So this is the larger aggression which is available. And I thought that vis-a-vis that, there is a different reading of Ambedkar outside that text. That text is utilized often. that is kind of misused text in that way. The title is misused. The way he argued his case, that has not been seen much. And that's why I bought that particular thing, that what is there inside. It is a very, very harsh criticism against Hinduism, against the Hindu reformists, against the socialists, against the left. Huge disagreement with them. And that's why outside that text there is a better values in which Ambedkar is writing and speaking and arguing. Democracy as a value in Ambedkar's writing. That value of suggesting that democracy means recognition and representation. Democracy means the formation of an identity for power, for sharing power. That happens without even annihilating caste. As I said, the term that I use, secularization of caste. That without diluting that, you allow that kind of constitutional mechanism so that communities can emerge and can claim power. So it is different kind of ideological game than the game that Ambedkar proposed in Annihilation of Caste. And that's why it is a making of recognition and redistribution in most of the other writings that Ambedkar is proposing. And that's why he's kind of somewhere keeping himself kind of distant from this kind of slogan. Annihilation of Caste was a slogan and not a kind of a necessity for larger democratic polity. That distinction I made from Ambedkar's writing, other writings, and Annihilation of Caste. Annihilation of Caste, I thought it stands alone. It is not kind of communicating with other writings of Ambedkar.
Thank you for your question. Actually, there are a lot of layers when we look at how the Dalits are, using form of dress to imitate a particular, either upper caste styles or the colonizer styles. Here, one has to understand that why first there is this need to imitate, or there is this need to emulate, and so there are various constraints. One is to directly associate oneself with this upper status, because clothing in the sense, and especially when I'm talking about prohibitions on certain clothing, for example, we have prohibitions even on if you are allowed to wear a sari, then even a sari has to be wrapped in a way which will show your particular status. So basically clothing, when it becomes a marker of a particular caste group, then that very marker is used as a symbol of either imitation, and then there is another politics when we talk about those very same markers are used to defy and resist. So on one hand it's just a simple emulation which is about not looking like something that we previously, Dalits previously looked like, and even sometimes, and this is something from my own very personal experience, that we've often heard, oh, but that person doesn't looks like a Dalit. Okay, so how does this whole appearance, dress becomes associated with particular identity? So there's this one which is very basic, emulation to look different. Then the other is about claiming alternative identity, and there those very markers which were used as a sign of subordination, they are used as as a marker of identity and upliftment. So this is so when we talk about emulation, when we talk about defiance, in all these cases the concern behind aspiring to look like and Herbert Spencer actually talks about this bit, where there is a sense by which the suppressor, the one who is suppressed, he actually imitates the upper class, the one who has dominated. So, okay, so that, I hope that answers your question.
Okay. I see one hand there. Those who have already asked will be discriminated against until we finish with the other. Yes, one more here. Anybody from this side? Let's start with these two then. Yes.
My question is to Harish. Harish, what you have done is, you have done
anti-historical reading of annihilation of caste text. And second, you didn't do the hermeneutics of annihilation of caste text. So when you try to read AOC in a historical perspective, see, you could, the questions that you raised were already addressed by the Dalit Sangha Samiti of Karnataka, the Dalit Panthers of Maharashtra, and also the MRPS of Andhra Pradesh and the current day Telangana. And also, when you read a text like AOC, in hermeneutics, one shouldn't get confused between reason and faith, or one should not be confusing between belief and faith. So, like within, if you do, like, you know, the aspiration of most of the sociologists will be like, you know, to do sociology of knowledge and end up becoming positive sociologists and do not address any of the hard questions. So, in your reading, I didn't see any question as a question. So, what did you actually want to argue?
Yes.
Yeah, my question is to Anupama. I think one also needs to understand how the change in context also leads to the way in which it becomes difficult to interpret whether clothing is a sign of domination or suppression. It can just swindle between them. I'll give you an example. Okay, in the pre-colonial India, Gopal Guru has worked on it. He has this edited book on humiliation. There were signs of clothing which were like symbol of humiliation for the depressed classes. But just I'll give you an example. This year, Pune University decided, since I come from Pune University, they decided to decolonize the convocation ceremony. They decided to disrobe the robes, okay? And unfortunately what happened is that at the end, when they were just about to decide what to go for, there was a tussle between the upper class Brahmins and the Dalits, okay? The upper class Brahmins in the university administration wanted to go for the Punekar Pagdi, okay? While as the lower caste or the Dalits, they wanted to go for the Phule Pagdi, okay? What Phule Pagdi was before it's not the same now, okay? It's something, it has shifted from something which is humiliating to assertion, an instrument of assertion. So I'll just want you to comment on that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Along the same line, because I thought that Anupama's paper was so interesting. Yeah, I don't know whether at this point we can introduce this aspect. See, for example, mimicry. Somebody asked that question, and maybe Satish could also reflect since he articulated it towards the end. Mimicry is a form of production. It's a reproduction. It's like you look yourself in a mirror, the image that you see is your image, but it's not you. The difference, the symbolic difference between what is being produced through mirroring and what is the reality, what is the subject that is being mirrored. The difference between these two is a huge space within which cultures change, civilization change their money and so on and so forth. So I think there's a possibility for reading of this mimicry, for example. Forget about defiance, but mimicry itself has many, many moments of self-production. Production of the self, which could be a substantive Dalit self, without being fractured by the
Anybody else? You want to start?
Okay, what I argued is that the annihilation of caste is not part of the agenda, of Dalit agenda. That annihilation is impossible. It is nothing but a positivist, modernist rhetoric, and it is an utopia. This is the first take. Second, I argued that to articulate or to understand caste today, democracy is a better tool. In that, what we do is nothing but recognition of different identities improvisation of those identities for political benefits, and a making of political or constitutional sense of identities for social justice. This is a bigger argument. So just these 2 points are there. I argued somewhere that annihilation of caste is utilized to criticize democracy and make it a kind of a debate between utopia and the pragmatism that democracy works with. And that's why I thought that this question is posed most often to the Dalits and not to the other counterpart. So that was a larger map that I had when I was presenting this particular thing. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comments. I'm actually glad that these kind of comments and suggestions have come, because as Professor Satish had said, that my paper is actually quite dense, and I do reflect upon these questions in my larger work, and due to paucity of time, somehow I have this concern. When it is from 15 to 12, I get a bit nervous. So to answer your question, as you gave this particular incident from a contemporary time period, here, something that I did not talk while I was presenting, this whole, a different kind of development which has happened, and which again has influenced the way Dalits have used dress, and that is fashion. So although in a particular time period, we can't really, attribute the aspect of fashion with Dalits, because fashion was something that happened, in this particular time period, and whether the fact that Dalits actually could use fashion in the sense that we understand now, to come up with a very different kind of dress styles. Okay, so the second thing is also about, and something that I did not mention, that in a particular time period, it's not that while they are defying, while they are imitating, they are only using different those very same items of dress, or those very same those very same practices which were which were prohibited. For example, now, if we look at, all the, Dalit activism has emerged in producing new kind of music, and here the whole idea is about producing a very different, different type of music, something which was initially prohibited. That entire space which was prohibited to them. And then, for example, I've also been looking, in fact, mentoring one of my students on this whole bit about Londa Raj. So there, the whole form of theatre, creates a certain kind of space, which need not necessarily be something similar to what is being practiced by the upper caste, and in fact, it is used as a form of assertion, and also said that since quote unquote क्योंकि वो जो normal theatres होते हैं वहाँ पे हम जा नहीं सकते, तो इसीलिए हम अपने तरह का theatre जो है वो perform कर रहे हैं. And so what I'm trying to say, that within this politics as well, there are different layers, and I'm not trying to say that it is upper caste vis-a-vis the lower caste, or the colonizer with the nationalist. So, and again, fashion is something that blurs these boundaries sometimes, and at the same time, I'm not saying that once you change your clothes, once you become fashionable, you actually do away with your caste status. And ma'am, thank you for your comment. And it was, I haven't really looked at the question of mimicry in terms of Dalits, but when I look at overall clothing changes, mimicry is not something that only the Dalit community is doing. In this particular time period, even the upper class, even the nationalists, when they try to experiment with different clothing, then somehow they borrow certain ideals from the colonizer, but then they are again complicated with this idea ki whether ye pehenna hai ki nahi pehenna. And so, and one of the, and in which I do, maybe, I don't know whether I'm actually getting it there, but when we produce the self-image as we want to see in terms of photographs, how do we actually want the others to see, and how do we actually want ourselves to see. So the way studio photographs have told me that even there is this sense of imitation as to how we would like to present ourselves. So maybe I will talk to you later regarding this. I don't think I have actually I've understood that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'm sure आपकी किस्मत अच्छी है, क्योंकि हमें बताया जाता है कि ज़्यादा समय नहीं बचा है, तो मेरी तरफ से ज़्यादा आपको ज्ञान नहीं मिलेगा. तो जो 2 मिनट बच रहे हैं उसमें मैं 2-4 मुद्दों पर कुछ प्रकाश डालने की कोशिश करूं. जिस बात को मेरे ख्याल से हरीश कहना चाह रहे थे अलग अलग ढंग से, और जो सवालों के जवाब में भी उन्होंने बार बार इसकी कोशिश की, वो उन्होंने परोक्ष रूप से कहा है, तो मैं उससे प्रत्यक्ष रूप से कह दे रहा हूँ कि जाति की परस्परता को जब तक हम संबोधित नहीं करते तब तक जाति का उन्मूलन असंभव है. Until we address the relational aspect of caste, its mutuality, that caste is a relationship, that it is not an attribute of certain people, we will not be able to talk about annihilation in any serious way. Because annihilation would then mean that those who feel that they have no caste, or those who feel that they have left caste behind, will also have to address caste. That is what annihilation really means. Annihilation cannot mean that we cease to talk about caste in public. That was never what was intended, and it cannot be the meaning of caste, the annihilation of caste. And just to, in the same spirit in which all the speakers have spoken, it's important to remember that we are talking about an issue that is not captured within or exhausted by a single text or a single leader. This is a much larger issue that concerns all of us, and the annihilation of caste is not a Dalit issue. I mean, that is, we have to understand that very clearly, because the entire problem, as the text called Annihilation of Caste makes clear, the problem starts with the upper castes. And if we are going to address the relational aspect, then we need to talk about it in a completely different way, and that is what we are repeatedly unable to do. And that is why we are constantly, after another 10 years also, there will be a seminar like this where we will be saying, can annihilation of caste be on the agenda? Is it on the agenda? What does it mean? Etc. etc. Those questions will continually be raised. When we, I'm grateful to Sajjad for bringing up the contrasting texts. As it so happens, I've just finished teaching Pakistan, or the partition of India, in my MPhil course, and I decided to take that up, deliberately decided to take that up rather than the annihilation of caste, which we have been teaching for several years now, precisely because it marks a very different moment. And I think if those of us who are interested in the text called Annihilation of Caste should remember that, let me put it very sharply and crudely because there isn't enough time, that text could only have been produced in that decade. It could not have, I don't think it could have been produced in any other decade than the 1930s, because it is a culmination, in a sense, of what reform movements about caste and political movements about caste at that point were talking about. And to refer to that text as though it should offer us a recipe of how to deal with caste today is, I think, completely unfair. And the contrast with texts like Pakistan or the partition of India is already in दोनों अगर आप पाठों को देखें तो ज़मीन आसमान का अंतर नज़र आता है, क्योंकि ये 1946 में लिखा गया, ये 45-46 छपते 46, तो the shadow of the new state to be is already present in this text, and I think this makes this a statist text. Annihilation of caste, whatever it is not a statist text, whereas partition is a statist text, and the differences that makes is, I think, quite instructive. We really don't have time to get into the details. There is a very interesting, fascinating, and difficult set of issues to talk about if we were to compare these two texts. I'm very grateful to all of the panelists for having in their own way brought up very difficult questions, and that was indeed मकसद भी यही था इस सत्र का कि और इस सारी गोष्ठी का कि मुश्किल सवालों को हम दोबारा पूछें, उनको पूछने की हिम्मत करें और आसान जवाब से हम जल्दी संतुष्ट न हो जाएं. And with that, we bring this session to an end. Thank you very much.
Is citizenship a limited concept? So it is a question that's expected to provoke discussion and perhaps argument. So if I was to translate it into Hindi, correct me Maninder if I'm wrong, क्या नागरिकता सीमित संकुचित सिद्धांत है? No, so I'm sure we have right now only Praveen here, but hopefully Umar will join us in a few minutes. So I request Praveen to make his presentation. I'm told that each presenter gets about 15 minutes to present. So Praveen, would you be timing yourself? I'll just warn you 2 minutes before your time is up.
Sorry. Thank you, Professor Roy. Thank you, Professor Maninder Thakur and Professor Purvanand for giving me this opportunity. I am also doing all of this because my computer is still in the process of starting, so I'll use this time to basically. Is citizenship a limited concept? Is the question for this particular session. As a student of social science, I'll say that if it is just limited concept, it's not essentially a bad thing because concepts are supposed to be limited to make sense and to convey a particular kind of a meaning. But I also recognize that the question is not framed in that sense. It is framed in a much broader sense, which basically means that is citizenship a kind of category, a kind of identity that provides for enough space for the political subject to express herself fully. So that is the question. Now if that is the question, I'm just going to say that it is probably true that it is a limited concept because we often see that it has to be hyphenated with something else in order for it to make a complete sense. And so we have like democratic citizenship or liberal democratic citizenship, or what I'm going to suggest here is if the time has actually come for us to ask the question if we live in the times of neoliberal citizenship. So that is the question that I am trying to answer here. Professor Sanjay Srivastava in his presentation this morning said in passing that we do not have neoliberal subject, we only have neoliberal policies. I am going to gently suggest that might not be correct anymore. We have been we have lived with the neoliberal policy framework for at least last 30 years now. So now is the time. Now is basically the time to actually see the kind of neoliberalism that has been established, and if not, then probably we have to move on and get rid of this term completely. My answer though is that we probably have a kind of neoliberalism, and we also have a kind of neoliberal citizenship. In order to make this point, I am going to make a couple of arguments, 2 or 3 arguments. The first point that I am going to make is that when the idea of citizenship was conceptualized in the beginning, at the inception of our constitution, it was predominantly conceptualized in the liberal terms, and there have been people who have spoken, including Professor Roy, who have worked on this thing and who have looked at the Constitution as a liberal document, in that sense. But I am going to focus on the way the Constitution basically helped people formulate their citizenship, and in that process, I am going to. This is the two works the recent works that have come up. I am going to just look at very, very briefly. I am going to look at Rohit Day's work, and I am going to also look at Ornit Shani's work on how India became democratic. So these two. So basically, Constitution as it was practiced by state institutions and also by the people, the way they perceive people, the Constitution. And then I sort of make a kind of historic jump and look at the contemporary. In order to ask the question if the way citizenship was conceptualized in the beginning as the liberal democratic citizenship, does it actually hold true today also, the way it is practiced now? And in order to make that point, I am looking at new urban spaces. An example from what I am calling new urban spaces. New urban spaces basically meaning the kind of urban space that has come up post neoliberal phase. So spaces like Gurgaon, for example, or spaces, I am especially going to focus on Noida, but we have other such examples in India where the new urban has actually emerged in the post neoliberal phase. I am doing that because I think that, and which is also my third point, that we have to now make a distinction, we have to make a shift from looking at neoliberalism as a set of policies merely to looking at neoliberalism as a kind of logic that organizes our political life. And in order to do that, I'm using a term, basically concept by Neil Brenner. He says that we have to now move towards what he calls actually existing liberalisms. So I'm looking at new urban spaces, especially Noida, as one of the examples of actually existing new liberalisms. And then finally, I basically ask the question: the way neoliberalism, the way citizenship is being practiced in the new urban spaces, like, is it the same as it was it was practiced in the beginning of the Constitution? And if not, then what are the implications? I do not have answers for the implication part, but I'm just going to flag the issues. So the way citizenship was conceptualized, the way people actually politically tried to reinvent themselves as the Constitution was initiated. In that process, I think the people themselves played a very important role, and the argument that Rohit Day makes in his latest book, People's Constitution, and he basically argues that the general perception is that the Indian Constitution was the Constitution framed by the top leadership, which had held certain kind of liberal values, and it was. It has been said that it was a sort of kind of document that was framed by the central leadership, and then people came to recognize it as an important document for their lives, only gradually. But Rohit Day, he makes the point that that is not true, especially looking at the Supreme Court documents and some of the initial cases that were brought to the Supreme Court by very, very ordinary people, and the way they then looked at their citizenship and entitlements in that light. So he has this very interesting case where there is this vegetable seller, a Muslim vegetable seller in one, I'm forgetting the name of this particular town, but it is a municipality. And as the constitution is being it's inaugurated, around the same time the municipality brings a new law saying that the marketplace is now contracted out, and then every vegetable seller who is selling vegetable in the marketplace has to pay a certain kind of tax to this money to this contractor. And then the vegetable seller actually goes to the court and he says that this is a violation of my fundamental right of occupation, basically have my own occupation. And then the Supreme Court gives the judgment in his favor, and then municipality has to strike down its tax. So this is the way in which citizenship basically got formulated. People approaching state institutions and practicing their politics at that level, and that resulting into an entitled citizen, which is premised on the basic ideas, basic liberal ideas of equality and freedom and other things that we see in the preamble of our constitution and in other places. Similarly, Ornit Sani's work, if you look at her work, she deals with the Election Commission of India, and the way even before Election Commission actually formally got established, the way the process of first electoral roll, the formulation of first electoral roll began in right earnest. People in the Constituent Assembly, members in the Constituent Assembly, anticipating that we are going to have universal adult franchise, and if we are going to have universal adult franchise, we need to have the kind of electoral roll ready. So even before the Constitution is actually inaugurated, this entire process gets kick-started. But the way in which state institutions then function, that plays a very crucial role in actually getting the liberal constitutional value translated as the state practices. And that is something that we see in the work that happens around this time in the Election Commission, especially. I think it's much known, but especially Sukumar Sen's, the first Election Commissioner's role, when he insisted. So when people were asked to actually enroll in the election process, in electoral rolls, a lot of women who came and they were not ready to give their own names, they were giving the name, as was the practice during that period, they were giving names of their husbands or fathers, etc. And there was a lot of such instances in the electoral rolls. And then the Election Commission had to take this call whether how to resolve this problem. But at that point in time, this Election Commission said nothing doing. If we do not have proper names of women, we are going to strike it down. So in my mind, that is a very, very important assertion of the liberal value that basically privileged individual identity, secular individual identity over other kinds of social identities. So this was the kind of environment. This was the kind of situation when this is how citizenship got embodied through the practices, state practices, which were in turn informed by the liberal values, constitutional values. And in this sense, then we have a kind of citizenship which is liberal democratic citizenship.
Also address us.
I'm sorry.
Left out.
No, it's okay. Yeah. Uh, I'm also feeling left out.
I'm giving you company.
Yeah. And I recognize that here I'm not actually defining citizenship in a very legalistic term, as in just to as an entitlement to be in a particular territory, the way it is. I'm basically looking at citizenship as a much more subjective kind of a identity, as political assertion of identity. So basically, this is the kind of background in which then I talk about briefly what is the situation now. I mean, what is the contemporary situation, and in order to get there, then I am basically saying that we have now lived in the neoliberal phase for last 30 years. It started, neoliberal policies got introduced mainly in 1991, but we have, gradually it got, sort of introduced in various spheres, mid 1980s onward. So we have lived with this kind of a policy framework for more than 30-35 years, and that is I think it's in the lifetime of a nation. It's not a big thing, but still it's a considerable amount of time, and I think it is the time now to actually look at neoliberalism not just as a kind of policy framework, but set of policies, but also something much deeper, which is the way our political life is organized. So fundamentally, how do I see the difference between, at that level, what is the difference between, say, the liberal and the neoliberal? In policy terms, we understand it is associated with liberal, privatization. It is associated with kind of marketization and things like that. But at this level, I think if I have to actually point at one fundamental feature of neoliberalism, it has to be that the transactional logic is at the core of the way neoliberalism wants to fashion a particular society, wants to fashion politics. So I think it was Zizek, for example, who cheekily says that you have freedom as long as you have the freedom to buy things, as long as you are being a consumer, as long as you are able to transact. So it is this logic. So in this sense, that then politics as such is also reduced as a kind of transaction in which you are, basically the political parties, for example, then becomes a kind of corporations, not seeking profit as such, but seeking political power, which is based on a particular kind of a pattern of transaction. So I'm trying to argue here that if we look at places like Noida and Gurgaon, especially the kind of gated communities that Professor Sanjay Srivastava was talking this morning, we do see that the politics as such is being seen in these places as a kind of through the lens of the logic of transaction much more than anything else. So the citizenship, the idea of citizenship is also, the political citizenship is also not based on the liberal ideas, but it is based on this kind of a logic of transaction. I'm just going to briefly talk about, I'm going to, my example for the new liberals, new urban space is Noida, and so Noida basically was established in late 1970s, 80s, and then it actually became it was established as the name suggests, it was supposed to be a new Okhla industrial development area, which is basically an extension of Delhi, but by 2000s we see that it is fundamentally, the character of the town changes fundamentally, and from, objective of being an industrial town, it becomes a kind of residential enclave, and then we see, the Noida Authority is the agency that controls which basically is the regulatory authority, and it has developed over a period of time, in phases. So there is a kind of morphology to it as well. And so if we look at the initial parts, which was closer to the liberalization process, it is still much more conventional in terms of the city space that we have in India. But as we get closer, 2000 onwards, for example, we have high rises and these middle class enclaves. Now, if we look at the residential patterns of Noida right now, we have three types of residential patterns. One would be, of course, the middle class and rich bungalows and the high rise buildings where middle class enclaves are located. The second pattern is the erstwhile villages. The villages on the land of which Noida was established, there are at least 80 such villages, which basically they are completely subsumed under the urbanization process. And then the third kind of pattern what we see is kind of slum clusters, which are also, they dot the city landscape. So what is happening in terms of state institutions, in terms of people practicing their citizenship, what is happening in Noida? I am arguing that if we look at the state institutions, they are conspicuous mostly by their absence, in the sense that Noida perhaps is the only city. There are other cities equally, Gurgaon also, but Noida does not have a municipal corporation. It does not have a municipal body. The municipal sort of functions are, just a kind of appendage to the functions that Noida Authority develop, carries out. But generally, which basically means that people do not have any kind of urban representation when it comes to the entire governance process. So the kind of role we see in the beginning of at the inception of the constitution, the kind of role that the state agencies, state institutions play in the process, we see that here it is just not possible because the entire logic is completely different. So the state presence as such ends at the gates of these gated communities, at the gates of these, and then what happens inside is completely privatized, which then means that so we have resident welfare associations and apartment owners association, which basically kind of play the role of a proto state, and so they are responsible mainly for two things which are also very, very important in terms of the functions, so the maintenance of the society or apartment and the security. So these state prototypes basically they substitute the state agencies inside these associations. If we look at the political practices of the people, and I'm just going to focus on the middle class enclaves, I'm not going to talk about villages, and I'm not going to talk about the slum areas. If we political practices, if you look at the political practices in these colonies, so the entire preoccupation of of these welfare associations, apartment owners association, is provision of security and the provision of just to maintain the society. And this entire process is also completely privatized, in the sense that these are outsourced to different, they are private limited companies, which are like kind of corporate organizations which are conducting security as well as the maintenance process. So there are supposed to be GBMs, I mean general body meetings, but people do not actually turn up in GBMs most of the times. Most of the conversations happen around WhatsApp groups and other such sort of electronic devices. Also, in order to regulate the functions of the UP Apartment Owners Association, they are model bylaws, and this is really interesting. According to this model bylaws, and then of course there voting that takes place, and then voting basically means that that is how the committee which looks after the apartment association, and that is basically elected. Now, the voting rule says that voting shall be on percentage basis, and percentage of the vote to which the owner is entitled is the percentage assigned in the dwelling unit, which basically then means that the citizenship, the degree of your citizenship to these apartments are basically linked to the per square foot of space that you own in that particular apartment, which is in complete contrast with the kind of idea of liberal citizenship that we have we discussed a bit earlier. So finally, to conclude, if we ask the question, what if this vegetable seller who had approached the Supreme Court in the 1950, after the introduction of the Constitution, for his right to occupation, and the Supreme Court actually gave the verdict in his favor. Can we? What if this particular vegetable seller lived in Noida today? What will he do? What will what are his chances of getting such a judgment? Even before that, So first thing, if he's a Muslim vegetable seller, the first thing, and this came up in the morning session as well, the first thing probably he'll have to do is to change his name to something more acceptable. The second thing that will happen is that he will not have a municipality, to sue. I mean, he will not know who to go to court against, because there is no municipality in Noida. Thirdly, know if even the Supreme Court is going to be very receptive to his idea of his basically occupational entitlements, and the Supreme Court is not, going by some of the verdicts that the Supreme Court has been given lately, is not going to actually say that no, actually the municipality and authorities have right to outsource and subcontract the spaces, and you have to pay the kind of charge that you are supposed to be paying. So if the answer to these questions are basically the kind of answers that I am coming up with, then in that case, actually there is something called neoliberal citizenship that exists today, especially in these urban spaces. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Praveen. Praveen has made some very interesting points, and I think Now, after we've had both the presentations, I'll invite questions. But I would like to perhaps flag two issues. One in terms of the originary moment kind of articulation that Praveen sought to bring before us, and the originary moment for him was the constituent moment, when the Constitution puts in place a certain idea of citizenship. And then he cites in particular two major works in the last years, Rohit Day and earlier on in Shani. And both of them are focusing on that period. One, Shani looking at the bureaucratic state in particular, when she looks at the electoral rolls and the preparation of the electoral rolls, she is looking at the idea of the people that is produced through a bureaucratic practices of preparation of. So maybe we need to bear that in mind. Rohit Days is perhaps more in the framework of transformative citizenship, where he invokes Manto to talk about the imaginary of the new state, and even if Manto's Mango is disenchanted with the old forms of the new state that sustain, the idea that everybody could collectively move to sovereign citizenship is something that he holds on to. So I will now invite Omar Khalid to make his presentation. So we have about 20 to 25 minutes for him to.
Thank you very much. My work has been, my PhD was on Singhbhum, which is a region in South Jharkhand, inhabited largely by the Ho community. Now, I seek to address, to be very frank, I'm not very well equipped in theories of citizenship, but I seek to address the question that has been framed for this panel by sort of discussing some of the themes that I also looked at during my PhD. I seek to do so by looking at contested ways in which people and communities have made a claim over their place and have made a claim over rights in opposition to certain other groups. Now, citizenship, as we understand, broadly means anyone residing within the territory of India, and the Constitution of India also makes it very clear that irrespective of race, region, religion, language, everyone is an equal citizen. But in the very originary moment of the Constitution itself, also there were, and this has been changed, there have been various modifications in this, but in the very originary moment of the Constitution itself, also there was an understanding that such a flat notion of a citizen that is devoid of the very different divergences and the differentiation within the social landscape of what is the Indian Union, the Constitution was accommodative of this. So it sort of incorporated various provisions to account for this divergent and differentiated landscape of India. For example, if there is a section 35A or section 370, article 370 in Kashmir that has been at the center of a lot of debate presently. In the area that I studied, which is Jharkhand, which is a part of a larger tribal tract of central and eastern India, there were also certain exceptional forms of administration, and the Constitution incorporated those things within it. The older, what the colonial state demarcated as excluded areas, partially excluded areas, that got reworked as into the 5th schedule and the 6th schedule in the scheduled areas. Under these areas, you have provisions which empower the village bodies, the gram sabhas, the village panchayats, and there is also restrictions on alienation of tribal land belonging to communities who, in administrative parlance, are categorized as scheduled tribes. And those lands cannot be given over to non-tribals, and non-tribals cannot take over those lands without the consent of these local bodies. Beyond these broad laws, there are also continuities with certain laws and acts framed by the British, which sort of sought to recognize custom. So, for example, in the area which I studied, which is Singhbhum, there is this law which has sort of continuously continued to evoke controversy in the post-colonial ever since 1947, which is the Wilkinson's Rules, framed and named after one British military official who sort of recognized the village headmen, the tribal headmen, as local nodal officers of the British Raj back then. So they were given duties back then of rent collection, also local police officers. So this law also is there with various modifications. Now, the question of the fact that the fifth schedule and the restrictions that the fifth schedule puts on transfer of tribal lands, and also its violation over the past few years, especially since a particular developmental paradigm has been pushed by the state, is very well known. It has precipitated almost a civil war-like situation in what is seen as a scramble for mineral resources in central and eastern India. But that is not a story that I seek to address in this presentation, and it's beyond the scope of this presentation. My focus instead is to critically interrogate and look at how these exceptional forms of administration have become rallying points for several tribal rights activists to resist the encroachments of state and capital in the Adivasi hinterland. The argument, which has become very commonsensical also and has been reproduced in a lot of journalistic literature as well, goes something like this. The Adivasis are the proverbial sons of the soils. The indigenous people of these areas, who are comprised of communities that moved into these areas centuries ago in the face of external aggression, they cleared the forest, they made fields, they are living in harmony with themselves, with nature through their own village bodies. And they were disturbed for the first time by the colonial state, which brought in its wake also outsiders from the caste Hindu society, the caste Hindus into these areas, and this led to a large influx of these areas, and this prompted various rebellions on the part of the tribals to preserve their independence. And the British realized their folly, and they also had to recognize the specificities of the Adivasis and the way they governed themselves, and that's why they gave statutory recognition to these village bodies, and which in a different form, in a modified form, the post-colonial state also recognized in the form of fifth schedule and sixth schedule. Therefore, the argument goes something like this, that the state in the present developmentalist model should not push certain projects that it has, and rather honor its constitutional commitments to honor these village bodies of the Adivasis. Recently, the success of certain movements also have bolstered this view. For example, in Niyamgiri, after Gram Sabhas, based on a Supreme Court order, the villagers in Niyamgiri organized Gram Sabhas to sort of stop the bauxite project of Vedanta. After that, that has also been, it has seen as how successful this model is and how it should be replicated elsewhere. A similar struggle was going on in Jharkhand when I was in Ranchi towards the close of 2014. And ever since then it's been there over the past couple of years. When I was in Jharkhand in 2014, in December 2014, that was the time when the Modi government had already come and the results to the Jharkhand State Assembly were announced. And for a state that has always been beleaguered with factional alliances, collapse of all previous governments, imposition of presidential rule thrice, the results were unusual. For the first time in the history of Jharkhand ever since its creation, a pre-poll majority had been able to secure a majority in the State Assembly, that is between the BJP and the All Jharkhand Students Union, AJSU. And for the supporters of this regime, this was a new dawn of stability in the state. And after it was able to secure a majority and form the government, it went on to do something more unusual in the history of Jharkhand, that is to appoint a non-Adivasi as the Chief Minister of the state, the Raghubar Das. Now, even that BJP projected as this as a challenge to the traditional entitlements of power. That's how they put it. But the mood amongst my hosts was quite the opposite, and it was quite somber. And they said that this is just a declaration of an anti-Adivasi intent of the government, and not before long are they going to attack our special rights, our special laws. And invariably, my hosts were an organization which has been involved in anti-displacement struggles, and invariably the discussion would come down to the scramble for Adivasi land, and therefore the legislations which sort of protect Adivasi lands, weakening that, diluting that, and the focus would be this one act called Chota Nagpur Tenancy Act that was framed in 1908. Now, before going further, just a brief, for those unfamiliar with this, just a brief description of the act. It was framed in 1908 in the backdrop of the Munda rebellion led by Birsa Munda. In the statements of its founders, the trampling of the ancient rights of Adivasis was going on for centuries by their more vile and avaricious neighbors, zamindars, jagirdars, moneylenders, traders, caste Hindus. And backed by the written word, these outsiders had trumped the claims of the Adivasis in law courts. The Adivasis who did not know how to read and write and had no idea of modern law, and their claims to land had rested on nothing apart from morality and custom. Shaken up by the widespread revolt of the 19th century, the colonial state sought to write down and protect these unwritten claims of Adivasis in official registers and land records. the act did this by giving statutory recognition to a category called Khunkhatti, which literally means the original settlers of a village. The rents of these areas were fixed at low rates, and the title deeds restricted the transfer to other and put a lot of restrictions on the transfer and alienation. Needless to say that this codification of land rights has rested very uneasily with several forces, and a century later, by 2008, this act had been amended a total of 26 times. And a certain lobby was always uncomfortable with this act. However, in a state that was beleaguered with factional alliances, completely doing away with CNTA remained a very tricky affair. After all, had not Jharkhand been created on the same logic as the CNTA, that is the restoration of the region to its original inhabitants. The major break for this lobby now came in 2016 after this majority came to power. And the stability allowed it to do what previous government had failed at. First it tried to bring an ordinance. When that did not get the presidential nod, it sort of passed it in the assembly. But no sooner had it passed it that it led to massive protests and a far-reaching crisis in the state. Opposition parties, including leaders who during their tenure had also tried to dilute the act, now seized upon the moment, sensing a political opportunity at this time. For example, Babulal Marandi commented that you cannot apply the age-old mentality of land acquisition in tribal areas, which has always been hesitant to embrace non-tribal world. The outpouring on the streets was followed by many journalistic articles trying to come up with a quasi-historical explanation of what is the CNTA and how land is at the core of tribal societies and how we need to protect it, how a clan-based land ownership structure is there in the Adivasis, and these kind of things started coming in. When I was reading these reports back then in Jharkhand in 2014, and during my MPhil and also in the initial years of my PhD, I was not quite comfortable completely with the kind of articulation that those who were opposed to the CNTA were also doing. I was not completely convinced by them. That is not to say that I am for the completely doing away of CNTA. But what if we were to formulate an internal critique of these current assertions? Has the CNTA really been able to safeguard the lands that it was sought to framed to protect? For example, there have been, despite protective legislations, there has been a huge number of people who have been displaced from these areas before even when the CNTA was even there. And in fact, there could always an enumeration of the disposition of people from the lands that have been quantified under CNTA. But what about those who are either landless or have no title deeds over their lands? Moreover, what have been the markers used over this period to codify these lands as Khunkhatti? This process of codification and this process of getting the lands enumerated within the documentary universe of the state. Who gained and who lost out? Did everyone gain as was articulated in those protests? And through these specific questions, if we were to pose certain larger questions, can one delineate a story of continuous conflict between tribals and non-tribals? And can the customary claims of Adivasis and their village bodies and their way of life that is seen to operate through customs and traditions, can that always be posited in opposition to the modernist paradigm of the state? Is the state intervention not constitutive of, or can it not be constitutive of customary claims, of customs, of traditions of these village bodies? That is the question that I try to pose. And I think that this engagement requires us to go beyond a simple binary of a homogeneous insider that is in threat from the outsider, and to look at it, to have a more historically informed, historically situated approach to this. Since my discipline was history, I tried to go back to that originary moment when that CNTA was framed, and to see how the different communities or how different sections within the Adivasi communities responded to this thing. Now, this casting of the conflict within this binary of an insider versus an outsider is a distinct legacy of colonial rule that is embedded both within the contingencies of rule for the British as well as representations of differences that were that employed 19th century anthropological discourse that was not averse to borrowing racial theories or even concepts from natural sciences to explain this difference. The Adivasis were described as savages in need of civilization, gullible, naive, childlike subjects who were in need of paternalistic protection. And from the 19th century itself, the tribal tracts were marked off as requiring special forms of administration, and it was invariably through co-opting their headmen into imperial schemes of governance that colonial policy was framed. However, as opposed to what some scholars have argued, it was not that the colonial state was preserving indigenous forms of administration. Rather, this recognition transformed the character and nature of these village bodies substantively. For example, in my area, according to the Wilkinson's rules, they became rent collectors and police officers, and with every increment of rent, and they were entitled to a commission, and with every increment of rent, their position, economic position increased. Their proximity to power also marked them off from the society. And beyond that, they were also given special incentives for colonial schemes. For example, by the middle of the 19th century, the colonial state embarked upon an ambitious project of agrarian expansion, of reclamation of a forested land. And it was these nodal officers of the Raj who were given incentives that if you are able to reclaim more land, then you will be given land grants, or you will be entitled to actually keep with you the entire rent that you collect from the villagers from these rents. So through all of this, what had happened is that by the end of the 19th century, a section within them had been able to expand and take control of a lot of land in these areas. And when the CNTA came to delineate the original settler, and when the colonial state was doing these surveys to find out who the original settler is, it was invariably these communities who could make their claims and trump the claim of other villages within the community. I mean, in my area, in between the 1910 and 1920, when the colonial state got into business of recording and codifying these land grants, it was mostly in most of the villages, out of 966 villages back then, that these rights were given to the tribal headmen themselves, who were the local nodal officers of the Raj. So much so that in the post-colonial state, when in 1960s the post-colonial state tried to once again carry out a survey and settlement operation and bring in, so for example, Bihar Land Reforms Act said that all lands will be vested with the state. It had to make a concession for these special tenure holders because they would just resist and they would not let the survey happen. Now, just to conclude, within this paradigm, if we were to come to the question and look at the question of how do we posit this democracy versus custom, from the end years of the British Raj in India, these policies of exception came under criticism from mainly the representatives of Indian National Congress, who saw them as a ploy of divide and rule of the British. But however, the Congress had to also contend with the nascent Adivasi politics, which was not averse to borrowing from this discourse, this colonial discourse, to make their claims vis-a-vis and carve out a space for themselves. And this bore an imprint even in the Constituent Assembly debates, and final constitution reflected more of a negotiated settlement between these two forces. However, unlike the past, these areas were no longer to be kept outside the purview of representative institutions, and this was to lay the grounds for a new dissension within the Adivasis. For example, from the 60s onwards till the present day, there has been a renewed conflict over two things. One is the Wilkinson's rules, the other is the Panchayati Raj. It was Wilkinson's rules, and the Manki Munda, the tribal headman system, was based on it was hereditary, and in the post-colonial state scheme of things, it was through representative institutions and through elected mukhia that the village body was supposed to be central. However, completely doing away with these village bodies also remained the older village bodies, the local nodal officers of the Raj, also remained a very contentious affair because one, they were powerful people, and the local politicians in those areas who were involved in electoral politics needed to command their support to actually be in elections. And they would go against their own parties also at different times to ensure that these sections are preserved and they are not completely done away with. However, their position started considerably reducing in the society. For example, with the introduction of a regular police force and also this official recognition of the mukhia as opposed to the tribal headmen, they started becoming slowly started becoming a shadow of their past. And the funds and government policies were routed through the village mukhia, not the tribal hereditary headmen. This led to a slow decline in their power, and they responded in a variety of ways to this change. Can I just take 3 more minutes?
Yeah, of course.
And I end with an incident that happened in the 1980s to look at how these sections have responded in different kind of ways to this change in their position, and they have tried to reconsolidate their position within their own communities. In the 1980s, there is this incident which was very strange. When in the 80s, some people invoking these special forms of administration, there was an organization called Kolan Raksha Sangh, and the Wilkinson's rules made a claim that Singhbhum, and especially the one region of Singhbhum, does not belong to India. Rather, it bears its allegiance to the Commonwealth, and it should rather be reconjoined with the Commonwealth. And it wasn't a small movement, which was, though it is largely forgotten now. This organization and the representatives even sent a delegation to England, France and Germany to present the case on international forums. The memorandum that they presented is a very interesting document. For the past, it reconstructs. In the narrative, it gives centrality to these different forms of exceptional administration and the various colonial acts, and says that because of these acts, this area retained its original domicile and never acceded to India. And now it should be once again be brought under the Queen. The movement was short-lived, and on their return from England and other places, they were immediately arrested and charged with sedition. However, another leader of this organization called Hembrom, he went underground and never came back only after the creation of Jharkhand. From his underground existence, he said that, well, we never demanded secession. What we were demanding was just a constitutional recognition of a tribal headman status. This was also the period when there was B.D. Sharma had launched this movement called Hamara Gaon, Hamara Raj. And these people also extended their support from their underground existence to this movement. Nothing much was heard from him. In 2001, he came overground after the formation of Jharkhand and began a new, fresh wave of activism. He started filing petitions in the Supreme Court and the High Court saying that you should recognize the Wilkinson's rules. And the Delhi, this area should be placed in the presidential rule, and Delhi had no jurisdiction over this area. And Lok Sabha elections cannot be held over these areas. Invariably, then this moved into contesting when they could not, of course, they could not stop the Lok Sabha elections. Then they moved into opposing the panchayat polls and not having the panchayat polls. A larger umbrella outfit of which this person supported also called it a wider conspiracy of the RSS to usurp tribal land, derecognize tribal administrative system, and threaten the very identity of people. Local politicians also tried to do it, but this was something that they could not fight, and they were fighting a battle that was they were fighting a losing battle, and eventually the panchayat polls were held in 2010 for the first time after a lot of years in Jharkhand. When the panchayat polls were held, the first response of these sections was to oppose the panchayat polls, call for a boycott, but eventually they came to start negotiating with the panchayat polls. And when I went there and when I spoke to these tribal headmen, they said that now we support either one of the candidates who is going to speak in our interest, which is to preserve our tribal headman system, which is to preserve CNT and everything. The argument that I am trying to make is that if the discourse of citizenship has to remain accommodative of these different fissures, simultaneously we also need to critically engage with discourses that are emerging from especially Adivasi movement that sort of posit tradition, custom and customary law in opposition to this modernist paradigm of the state. We need a more historically informed understanding that seeks to uncover how power also remains embedded and concealed within these fractured communities that are inhabiting this area.
Thank you. A very interesting exposition of the complex ways in which these laws of the state frame out and pan out in particular contexts. And if one was to put it into the framework of and bring it back to the frameworks of the organizers positing of the question, for quite some time now, citizenship studies has taken what is called the anthropological turn. So it's not as if citizenship is seen largely only in terms of nation-state belongings or juridical status. So it's more in terms of seeing citizenship as a connected idea, having a distinct capacity to weave together different sides. So I think Umar Khalid's presentation put before us one of those sides. And interestingly, if one was to kind of make some quick connections with the Pathargadi movement, for example, and one of the things a respondent told one of the researchers who went to that site was to say, when he was asked, why are you invoking the constitution after 70 years? And he says, constitution to abhi tak humse chupa ke rakha gaya tha. So it's like, if one was to make that quick link between what Praveen said and what Umar said later, there seems to be different ways in which one is looking at law, as constitutional practice. So I would open the two presentations for your questions and comments.
I appreciate the great papers. I just want to draw your attention to the other dimension of citizenship. And I think the nationalist movement in India actually tried to locate citizenship as a very fluid category. Because if you look at, say, article number 5 and 11, it says that nothing in this article shall stop the parliament in future to actually change the norms of citizenship in the country. Whereas in the case of Article 368, which is a power to amend the constitution, the court had already, in the latter part, restricted the parliament to exercise impunity. Why I'm saying is this because I wanted to say that, don't you think that the idea of citizenship in the country has rather remained locked up in the partition memories, for example? And I think when Ambedkar was speaking in 1947, he was saying that the law of citizenship in the country, which is enshrined in the constitution, is to be further reworked because the memory of the partition is so complex that we probably have to come back and see how the laws on citizenship can be reformed. With this perspective in mind, I want to know from the panelists if you can see, and I think on record, I think citizenship law has already been amended for a number of times.
Can you just repeat what Ambedkar's quote you were saying?
Ambedkar was actually saying that the citizenship law, which is being proposed in the constitution, because he was speaking in 1947, before the finalization of the constitution. So he already hinted to the idea that the citizenship law in the country is to be actually reworked in the light of probably the partition. Which means, if you look at today, 2016 CAB law, Citizenship Amendment Law 2016, probably I think it really rallies very well with what was said in 1947. Okay. My only simple question is...
Your question?
Yeah. My question is simple, that can the panelists today locate the idea of fluidity of Indian citizenship in the light of the burden of partition? Partition memory, when I hope you can sense what I'm trying to raise here. Actually, I'm raising this question in the light of CAB's 2016 proposed bill, Citizenship Amendment Bill 2016. I'm trying to link the two.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you, Umar. It is such a nice presentation. But it is not a kind of question, but it is kind of simple inquiry. That throughout your presentation, you are talking about the problem or the issues related to the whole community in the Sebum area. So, what is the basic issue on which we can think of our problematic issue that are claiming the customary claim of whole community or the posing the liberal holding the rights or the democratic right within the liberal or modern paradigm which we are talking about. What is the main region of the means on which we want to think on? This is the question. And one question or the Parveen. Throughout, I think the idea of citizenship, you are trying to explain that throughout a kind of new in the coming up of the new urban area or development. The idea of citizenship is shrinking. But thing is that in the process of, throughout the process of citizenship as a client, citizenship as a consumer, and now citizenship either in the new urban space. So, which means I am just not able to understand that which idea of citizenship you are defining. Is the where means you can say that is the better in the term of sovereignty and the individual rights to means just
Yes.
Was there somebody else?
No, only you.
No, I just inviting comments from both the panelists since we talked about citizenship in Singhbum and citizenship in Noida, and the framework of, very interestingly, the absent framework in Noida of the son of the soil compared to Singhbum, where the sons of the soil or natives was very relevant. To the contemporary context where we see the same basic framework of sons of the soil versus outsiders being played out very, very differently in places like Assam, Kashmir and Chhattisgarh. Whether you have any comments on that in the light of your own areas. And just an aside, a kind of trivia thing for Praveen. You mentioned that in the first census commissioner and was very insistent that names, proper names,
The chief election.
Yeah, the chief election commissioner. Sorry, not my point is about the census. I want you to know that the Census of India Act 1948 still has a section which says that women cannot be forced to name their husbands or any other male relatives whom custom says that they should not name.
Okay.
So the Census of India Act 1948 has provisions like this at the same time as, so what I'm saying is that the state is multiple.
Yeah, negotiating. Yeah.
My question is say regarding NRC in Assam, especially about the say illegal, migrant illegality and the idea of citizenship. For example, what I'm seeing similarity in both of the presentation is that as individual citizens are supposed to ask for more rights, right? For an example, the Muslim vegetable seller, or for that matter, the community in Singhbum, right? So, at first hand, you are already a citizen of India, and then the denial, okay? So for an example, especially that this entire exclusion of, people from the list, okay, electoral or whatever. So, how do you see that? First you are a citizen and then you are not. That's my question.
Yeah.
खड़े हो जाइए तब दिखाई पड़ेगा.
This is to Praveen. How would you see relation between Noida is a new liberal city and smart cities project. So would you look at new liberal citizenship within a new liberal city as David Harvey would envisage in the context of Paris and New York and other cities? And secondly, this is a formulation coming from E.M. Wood when she says that we have political equality but we don't have economic equality. So this is the framework of liberal democracy, that we have a political equality and economic inequality. In that sense, we have always new liberal citizenship, not after 1991, because you are seeing, because political right or political equality doesn't guarantee economic equality. So how would you locate, how would you see your Wood's framework?
Thank you.
Yeah, so Praveen, could you come in
Okay.
first?
Okay.
To Noni's question and to the other questions about citizenship bill, basically, I think I'm not going to say much. I'll leave it to Professor Roy to comment on, because she has worked on the history of citizenship in that sense. Except to make this small point that you're right that citizenship, I think it was left, citizenship as a concept was not very, very legally sort of tightly defined during that period. And you are right, I think, also about why it was not done, because the kind of the political moment that in which the constitution was being drafted was also the political moment of partition, and in which this question of citizenship actually was glaring at the face of the people, the constitution makers. And in that they actually, I think consciously, I think Professor Roy will say more, but I think consciously decided to leave it that way and have a very, very instrumentalist approach to the idea of citizenship, so that it remains more inclusive. Now we have, of course, we are moving in different direction. To the question here, I think so basically I'm defining citizenship not in a very legal sense. I'm looking at citizenship in the way an individual practices her politics, especially in relation to the state and state institutions. And that happens in various ways, and that happens on daily basis. And I think it is through the political, the way we practice whatever in our daily life, the way we basically relate with institutions and with each other, we actually define our own citizenship. So it is in this sense that I'm talking about the shift from what I'm calling the liberal citizenship in the beginning of the in the inception of the constitution, and then now looking at the urban spaces, citizenship practices in the urban spaces, and here it is more it's what I'm calling the new liberal citizenship. To Professor Deshpande's question about son of the soil, missing son of the soil in Noida, it is actually not missing. It was missing from my presentation because I decided not to focus on the rural Noida as much as I decided to focus on this thing. Actually, the son of the soil exists in Noida villages in the most literal sense you can imagine. So there is kind of all these urban villages, especially in Noida that we have looked at, they are going through an identity crisis at various levels. So these are post-agrarian villages in the sense that the land on which that supported the entire agricultural economy is gone, and now suddenly there is money to people who actually had titles to those lands. Others do not have that kind of money. There is a lot of influx of people from outside, even within the village boundaries, because that is one major a source of income that the villagers have decided they have to rent out the newly constructed houses that they have. But why I'm saying that it is most literal, we also find that in Noida villages you have a new kind of social institution emerging, which is akhadas. And akhadas not in the Kumbh Mela wala sense, but literally akhadas where pahalwans basically they are so you have a main pahalwan training younger people, and you also find that around these akhadas these are becoming socio-political kind of public spaces in villages. Also, there is a political economy to it, because most of the villagers, young people, they do not have they do not have that kind of education to basically go to the office buildings which are just nearby. So they go to various security agencies, and so akhadas then become a kind of training ground. You also find kind of reinvention of the past in a way, and they are looking at trying to invent and find legends and from freedom struggle times. So when you look from Arya Samaj movement and things like that, they are trying to look at. So we think that what they have actually lost in space. So space around them, they are completely subsumed in the, high-rise buildings. So what they have lost in space, they are trying to find in time, going backwards. To Dhananjay, of course, I mean, David Harvey is important. I have not talked about David Harvey, and I wanted to talk about real statization of urban development that happened in 2000s, and that was actually. So if you actually look at Noida, you can actually see it with your eyes. So 15 sectors closer to Noida will have bungalows, and as you go deeper into Noida, you have high-rise buildings. And then you see that, okay, so basically these are different phases of urban development. In the initial phase, it was still a state control, and so it was basically people were given plots, and many people actually got those plots. And then the privatization of the entire urban process that began in 1990s and then, actually got really articulated in 2000. So see that then, it became a kind of space. Then you see that space becomes not only a form of finance, it also becomes a sort of consumable. So these are so you have like people who live in these spaces, they want to consume a particular kind of lifestyle through the kind of space that they are living in. Finally, your point about, actually I was trying to make the point that in this kind of, that is the most stark thing about it, that delinking of political sort of freedom from political equality from economic equality that we see in the liberal form of democracy is something that I think which is missing in this particular article of bylaw that gives voting right to people in these apartment buildings, which basically then it is relinking the economic sort of inequality with political equality by assigning that kind of percentage of voting weightage to people who have larger flats versus the people who have smaller flats. I think I have covered
that. First come to the question that Professor Deshpande posed, and also the other question about citizenship and NRC, and the question in the present times of that was a question I was thinking yesterday when I sat down to sort of just make a small outline of what all I'm going to present, and I thought that let me address this question of immigration and the fears around that, and I could not make a coherent argument, so I left that out. So what might follow might be a very incoherent response, but I'm just thinking out aloud that there are, globally right now around immigration and these fears are playing out in what is termed as xenophobia or what is termed as far-right politics. In India also there has been a longer history, say in Maharashtra, but now mostly in Assam, and this is this project of first the NRC and after that the Citizen Amendment Bill of defining the citizen and this positing the citizen vis-a-vis an outsider. Now that is a trope that is deployed all the time in Adivasi politics, in Adivasi organization, in Adivasi movements. Also in literature that has been sought to understand Adivasi movement. And of course these two different examples are not the same. Say what is happening right now in Assam and what is have been happening in Jharkhand for a long time. In fact, in the long movement for Jharkhand also made that point again and again of defining themselves in opposition to ethnicity plays a role, and ethnicity, and then claims are made based on the question of ethnicity. What is a very important, the term that this indigenous politics, the question of indigeneity. However, while these may not be similar or parallel examples, and one cannot rubbish off these claims in Jharkhand by saying that, well, these are also replicas of xenophobic fears playing out elsewhere. But my argument that I'm trying to make is that this also does not encapsulate the complexity of the problem and complexity, and what Alpa Shah in one of her recent works has called this dark side of indigeneity, where those who claim to speak in the name of indigenous also go on global forums where the international financial institutions also work through these bodies to sort of put out certain schemes through certain NGOs and ensure that these schemes are operationalized and facilitated through these bodies. And though in Alpa Shah's own work, I see her contradicting herself when she makes a contrary argument to what the central argument that she's trying to make. But not getting into that. But for example, even say, why I'm saying that this does not encapsulate this entire framing of the question as the outsider, as a resisting the outsider, which was, say, to borrow from Ranajit Guha, which was a Sarkar Sahukar Zamindar in the colonial times, and now it's the state corporate nexus presently in, say, what is happening right now in these areas. It does not capture the entire complexity of the problem. And when I was going across these news reports of Niyamgiri and all these movements, I came across a very interesting report and by Anumeha Yadav, who was based in Jharkhand and doing reports for the Hindu from there, where in Singhbhum, Rungta Mines had to take over a piece of land, and Rungta Mines organized Gram Sabhas themselves, and the Gram Sabhas themselves agreed to give over their land, which was resisted by the villagers. The villagers were resisting the Gram Sabha. And after the panchayats and after the Gram Sabhas, the tribal headmen could be seen given SUVs and different kind of gifts by the mining company. And when I was reading that report, I could find almost similar parallels in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, of how the colonial state was also using these fissures to sort of push through certain rent schemes, to push through certain projects and a lot of things. So my argument that I'm trying to make is that these are differentiated communities and the struggle is as much internal. It's also an argument that, say, Nandini Sundar makes, that state policies also find a receptive ground in the differentiation within communities. I mean, let's not forget that one of the things that sort of evoked and had been in a lot of debate about a decade ago, the Salva Judum. The person who started the Salva Judum was himself a tribal, Mahinder Karma, who took on the name of Karma, but his original name was something else. And he started it because he felt that the Naxalite movement, if it expands there, it might also take over his lands. So this complexity also needs to be understood, for else we would not be able to situate the way power operates in these areas. Having said that, these questions of immigrations, as I said, that one needs to have a more, every example is different. So say in what's happening in Assam and what's happening elsewhere and what's happening in Jharkhand, these are different examples. If I could understand your question exactly, what is the way out is, I mean, in terms of, that is the larger question that you're posing. Like, of what is the prescription of rule in that scenario? If this is the liberal understanding of citizenship and this is the identitarian assertions, the scope of this presentation, it was beyond the scope of this presentation to give sort of a way out. But somewhere one also has to bring in, when I say historically more situated approach, one has to also bring in the question of political economy and the question of democratization within, to be able to say, if in a Gram Sabha, it's invariably the village heads that are going to be represented, and if there is inequality in villages within Adivasis themselves, then that is also going to reflect in their village bodies, and that is not. So there is a need to also address that inequality within. This last question of partition, I don't have an answer to this in terms of how it bore an imprint on citizenship. Broadly, yes, it did bear an imprint, but in the specific presentation that I made, the only thing I could think of was when in the Adivasi politics that was when there was a devolution, a partial devolution of power to representative institutions from 1919 onwards, and there was a rise of this organization called Adivasi Mahasabha that was led by Jaipal Singh, who was also in the Constituent Assembly later. There were at different times these claims that were being made, not just on behalf of Adivasis but also on behalf of, say, what we today call Dalits, being made by Ambedkar, or the Muslim League Jinnah was making different claims. And there were different times when they were also collaboration and them coming together in the 30s. But in the 40s onwards, one sees the Adivasi politics trying to distance itself away from the Muslim League and saying that we are not with the Muslim League, rather we are with the Indian Union and we are not for this partition, making that very clear again and again. But in within India, we need to have certain safeguards. But beyond that, I cannot think of an answer.
Are there further questions? We have about 5 to 7 minutes.
It's for you.
So now we've had an interesting interaction, and I think there are some issues which we may perhaps still look at. One of the things that I thought, which in order to just tie up the discussion, is to look at where the fault lines in debates on citizenship exist now. One of the fault lines, Noni, you hinted at when you said that these are these big frameworks of legal citizenship which invoke the partition, and how is it that the partition still looms large and blocks, you said, the legal ideas of citizenship. The other fault line I thought Praveen invoked when he said, what is it that happens in a neoliberal space? And invoking the idea of neoliberal citizenship, to me, brings out another category, which is one of risk. If you talk of a market society, there are issues of risk involved in what kind of claims you're making and what kind of risks you are therefore addressing. And I think for the practice of citizenship, risk is a useful category, because the moment you say risk, it's not just a neoliberal passive consumer citizenship that you're talking about other kinds of risks which entire process of citizenship invokes. Even the process of leaving your village to take up a job in an urban space like Noida involves a risk, and people who join movements, there is a risk. So what are the risks that citizens take, and what are the claims to citizenship and expansion of citizenship and elaboration of citizenship that happens, therefore, is one of the things perhaps that we could look at, so that the citizenship doesn't remain constrained. I would like to talk a bit about the question that Noni raised, particularly because it's provocative. When you invoked Ambedkar, there seemed to be a mislocation of Ambedkar in the contemporary context of the debates on the NRC, because this is precisely what the JPC is doing. If you read the Joint Parliamentary Committee report, the Joint Parliamentary Committee report makes a big deal about Ambedkar's speech in the Constituent Assembly to say that the provisions in the Constitution are ad hoc, they are temporary. And they go on to say that Ambedkar actually says that the entire principle of citizenship can be restructured and an entirely new legal framework can be introduced. And this is what the 2016 bill is actually doing. It's changing the principles, the premises of citizenship. Going back to the partition as an unresolved, because the JPC is also at this point invoking Shyama Prasad Mukherjee to say that the pledge and promises that were made to people who were not included in India needs to be addressed, because it's not a humanitarian concern, but it is a concern for the dignity, etc., the sacrifices that they've made. So there are contradictory invocations, Ambedkar and Shyama Prasad Mukherjee. But I think what both the NRC and the 2016 bill are doing is they are totally disregarding the inclusive frameworks of citizenship that were invoked post-partition. So if illegal migrant was a legal category introduced in 2003, displaced persons was an administrative category, 1947 onwards, and was being addressed through institutions, the embryonic institutions of the new state, if you want. And the conversations, if you were to read the archival files, you would see that there was a spirit of resolution, rather than extraction of residual categories to say that these don't belong and these need to be absorbed. So a completely different revocation of citizenship is something that we see in 2016, and that is a major fault line in the contemporary debates on citizenship that we must politically address.
Thank you very much. अनुपमा, उमर खालिद और प्रवीण। आज़ाद, जैसा मैंने कहा कि अचानक उनसे संपर्क हमारा टूट गया और बहुत कोशिशों के बाद भी संपर्क बन नहीं सका। इसलिए हम चाहते थे कि वे रहें, क्योंकि असम की पूरी बहस आज़ाद के ज़रिए हो सकती थी, लेकिन हम उससे वंचित रहे। बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया आज के सारे पैनल्स का और आप सारे लोगों का। कल हम लोग 10 बजे फिर इकट्ठा हो रहे हैं और कल के जो पैनल्स हैं मैं दोहरा रहा हूँ उनको। कल पहला सत्र है डज ट्रुथ एग्जिस्ट। ईश्वर सिंह दोस्त उसकी अध्यक्षता कर रहे हैं। मुजफ्फर अली साहब, सौरभ दुधारिया और परवेज आलम इसमें शामिल हैं। दूसरा सत्र है इज डेमोक्रेसी फेसिंग ए टर्मिनल क्राइसिस। सार्थक बागची, नोनी मताई और शुचि भारती इसमें शामिल हैं। और तीसरा सत्र जो खाने के बाद है वह है इज कम्युनिकेशन पॉसिबल। मनोज झा, प्रोफेसर मनोज झा इसको इसके अध्यक्ष हैं। प्रोफेसर माधव मेनन, रवीश कुमार और मनोज कुमार इसके पैनलिस्ट हैं। और आखिरी सत्र खुला सत्र है जिसमें हम सब लोग मिलकर जो बातचीत हुई है उस पर फिर से विचार करेंगे। आप सबका कल 10 बजे स्वागत है। और अभी अंग्रेजी में जिसे हाई टी कहते हैं, जिसके लिए कोई हिंदी शब्द